When you talk about arcade games, like, you have such awesome memories of, like, either going with your friends or just, like, that's what kept your attention for hours and hours and hours and hours when you were a kid.
Arcades were great and they were a fad for a while, but looking back now, it's if you look at one, it's almost like looking at like a malt shop in the 50s. It's just not a thing we have anymore.
You know, so in the early 70s, Pong was actually a hit in bars, right? But it was toward the end of the 70s that games like Space Invaders came out, these huge moneymakers, actually established a reason to have dedicated arcades.
And here you have dedicated gaming centers for people to say, let's put a center for kids to play games, and the games will come. And sure enough, hot on the heels, Pac-Man was at the height.
So Pac-Man in a lot of ways is the first video game character. Before that, there's just a lot of spaceships, a lot of boxes and triangles, bleeping and blooping. But Pac-Man's kind of like a person. And you know, you can put him in a Saturday morning cartoon, you can put him on the cover of Time, you can put him on kids' lunchboxes. He has a wife.
That time period between, you know, say 1978 and maybe 82, 83 was sort of the golden age of arcades. Every year you had new games that were pushing the technology, making a heck of a lot more money.
You got Donkey Kong, you got your pole position, you got your Frogger.
You know, you had the Star Wars arcade game, which was huge. Centipede. They all used different control mechanisms. So some were joysticks, some were paddles, others used a trackball.
Video games eventually became so mainstream that there's a movie based on video games, Tron. And then in turn, of course, there's a video game, Tron, based on the movie.
So by the early 80s, you've got about 1.5 million arcade machines in the country. Together, people are playing about 2 million hours a year on these machines. That's a lot of time for people to spend going bump, 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 like that.
I mean, we all just pulled together. Someone had to stop the centipede invasion. Had to be us.
The video game industry in that period from the late 70s to the early 80s was out of control. It was pulling in $20 billion a year, which was more than Major League Baseball, football, and basketball were pulling combined. This is ridiculous. Probably explains why Americans are pretty fat.
Now this was a peak, but we knew it couldn't last forever.
Every year, the video game industry was just growing, and it was growing in terms of the money it was bringing in terms of the number of people who were actually visiting arcades. People involved in the industry really didn't think there was anywhere for it to go but up, and it actually ended up peaking and not growing any further because the investment started to exceed how many people were actually going to play the games.
When arcades started to fall, the first people to feel it were places that should never have had games in the first place. Places like grocery markets, you know, restaurants, senior citizen homes, synagogues. Those all disappeared. After that, the huge theme parks built around the idea that video games were just a never-ending growth business, those started to fall. By the end, the only places left are in the middle, the medium-sized arcades. A little dark, not as glamorous, but just reasonable enough to turn profit.
And then around 86, 87, the Nintendo had come out and became really popular, and that revitalized the entire game industry, but it moved the focus back into the living room.
Arcade games, because it was such a business made up of 100 companies, they wouldn't advertise on TV. Whereas Nintendo, they're like, Mom, buy your son this, buy your son this. And then for the son, they're like, tell Mom to buy me this. Birthdays, Christmas, you can't give an arcade game realistically. You can give a Nintendo.
So actually, the Nintendo system and arcades, I mean, could actually kind of peacefully coexist. The nail in the coffin for arcade games is when the Sega Genesis came out in like 89, 90. Because, you know, it was arcade games that you could play at home. It was direct competition.
Now, Sega was making arcade games, but they decided to make the same versions of the games for their new home console. Now, why did they do that? It's not because they didn't want to make money in arcades anymore, but they said, we can do better if we start selling these games directly to the consumer. You don't have to go to Joe Bob's Pizza Shack anymore. We can just say, hey, Mr. Consumer, watch this commercial on TV and go out and buy this game yourself. So Sega was cannibalizing their own arcade audience, but they had seen the writing on the wall. They knew that home gaming was the wave of the future.
They were able to replicate the arcade experience pretty well. So first and foremost, the fact that you could get Strider, Altered Beast, Afterburner on your home systems when you bought your Genesis eliminated the need to go to the arcade. But then the other thing that started happening is that being able to play these games at home, people started to ask for longer, more involved video game experiences than they had previously had.
Arcade games are designed to kill you. They're designed to be frustrating. If you could just sit there and play it forever, it would not be a profitable business. Whereas the home games work with you a little more. They're a little more fun. You can do things like explore, you can tell a story.
Like the levels onto which like you were stimulated were just completely changed, and they were like more involved. You know, like you were actually becoming like the character, and you had to like think about where to go and what to collect and what to do and like where to find things.
The real case in point for this is Neo Geo. This is a system that was designed to be as good at home as it is in the arcade. The games were the same in both. And even though the price point was abnormally high, the games were just very boring, and they weren't the kind of games people wanted.
Why do I want to spend, and in this case, $54 for a game that gives me 3-minute bursts of fun? Nobody wants that. They want something deeper.
You know, gamers grew up and they wanted more variety, and you know, the home console offered that. They had horror games, you know, adventure games, role-playing games, sports games. I mean, how do you play a sports game in an arcade? It's like impossible.
So when you go home, you have this just rich tapestry of genres you can play with, and that's why arcades died. They're a very narrow set of fleeting experiences, and you know, we just outgrew them.
What was interesting is that when you're in the arcade, you're basically putting in quarters and you're trying to last as long as you can with a limited amount of money. And there's a real financial incentive when you get Final Fight at home and you can just continue and play till you beat it. It totally sucks any fun, and you realize right away that those games suck.
The dead cat bounce of arcades, right when they bounce, right before the final death cry, is Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat.
These games are going to test your skill against complete strangers, people you don't know. And you know, you get bragging rights, and people are always stepping up to the challenge, trying to challenge them.
That's something that's very important in the development of video games. It never really went away. It's just now we do it online. And there's elaborate ranking systems, so you know exactly how good the person you're playing is versus how good you are.
So the last thing that the arcades had to hold on to was that social interaction and that competitiveness against strangers. Well, you know what? That even fizzled as soon as the internet came along.
I think there will always be arcade games around though, just like for nostalgic purposes. Just like, you know, I don't want to get rid of that Frogger game that's been sitting in the back of the store because it's been part of history. You know, it's like, it's sad, but it happened.
So we grew up, and the games grew up, but the arcades, well, they couldn't grow up, and they couldn't change, so they died. But they died for us. They died so we could have Oblivion and World of Warcraft and really complex artistic games like that.
Arcades had to die for the art to evolve. You know, you can't make an omelet without destroying a few businesses. That's the bottom line.